First, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am, the Gadigal people, and give my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to this second in our series of seminars on being religiously human in a techno-scientific world. This is a joint series of seminars organised by the Sydney College of Divinity Theology Research Network and ISCAST, whose full name is Institute for the Study of Christianity in an Age of Science and Technology. Bit of a mouthful. Anyway, it's my pleasure to welcome you all, and certainly my pleasure to welcome our speaker and our respondent today. Our speaker is my friend and colleague, Reverend Dr. Associate Professor Doru Costache.
That's a mouthful, Neil.
That's a mouthful. Over my 5 years at the SCD, working in the research office as I do, Doru is one of the SCD's most prolific and high quality researchers, for which we are truly grateful. He currently is ISCAST Research Director and Associate Professor at the SCD, and he lectures at two of the SCD colleges, St. Eusebius and St. Cyril's. He's also an honorary associate at the Studies of Religion at Sydney University, where he's doing a second doctorate. So welcome, Doru. I'd also like to welcome Lisa Sedaris, who's Professor of Environmental Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. This is truly a great experience for us to have an international respondent of such solid reputation and standing. So thank you very much, Lisa, for joining us. She's the author of Consecrating Science, Wonder, Knowledge and the Natural World, and another book, Environmental Ethics, Ecology, Theology and Natural Selection. So I won't introduce you again when the time comes. The format for today is that first Doru will speak. We will then invite Lisa to respond, and we'll give ourselves a short break, and we will throw the session open for discussion. So thank you, Doru. Doru's topic for today is human flourishing through contemplation of nature in an age of science. Doru, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you, everyone, for your attendance. I'm overwhelmed, and yeah, I have to confess my emotions seeing some of my friends here. As I said earlier, all the friends, newer friends, people whom I have never met in person, but I know via other means like academia.edu and so on and so forth. And of course, I'm very grateful to Lisa for her kindness and the effort of speaking to us from California at a time when perhaps she has better things to do at night. My topic, as Neil already advertised it, human flourishing through the contemplation of nature in the age of science, has also a subtitle which I have added in the meantime. After I sort of had an idea of what I want to say, I started to read a book, and this gave me a very different idea of how to proceed about all these. Anyway, but let's roll the ball. Recently, I have begun to read for the first time Walter Percy's 1983 book, Lost in the Cosmos, reissued digitally in 2011. I had it there in storage, just good to read in preparation for an undertaking like this one. So far, it has proved to be a useful read, not only for the healthy dose of the author's humor, or his psychosocial thought experiments, or the semiotic lens he deploys from time to time, but also for mapping the territory of interest here, the self and the world, the latter understood as both nature and culture. One of the book's many subtitles captures this topic with utmost clarity as well as with transparent irony. How you can survive in the cosmos about which you know more and more while knowing less and less about yourself. So that's a subtitle. That says it all. It is not just a matter of knowing increasingly more about the universe, whatever that might mean, and I shall return to this issue. It also is the matter of realizing how much we, Blaise Pascal's thinking reads, are eclipsed by our very knowledge of the universe. And so, a deeper terror than the horrible revelation of Steven Weinberg undermines our emotional stability and general well-being. You know, in Weinberg's words, the prophecy that the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless, and that the effort to understand the universe is one of the very few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce and gives it some of the grace of tragedy. Anticipating this view by a decade, Percy himself refers to the comic mystery of your own existence. Now, this unsettling news about science and us in the epilogue of Weinberg's classical book, The First 3 Minutes, sums up the worst contemporary theology has to tell us, that when it comes to asserting order, beauty, meaning, and purpose in the universe, all boils down to nothing. This view is not new. Weinberg seems to simplify here Pascal's rhetorical claim that, I quote, the eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me, as well as his equally rhetorical point about the infinite immensity of the spaces I ignore and that ignore me. This perspective is repellent to the human mind, the self, and Lisa Sedaris shows that our everyday experience does not happily accommodate cosmic large scales. I'm referring to an article she published in 2019 in Zygon, Wonder Sustained, a reply to critics. Rightly, Walter Percy lists a range of shades of grey between the self's two main responses to the horror of a pointless existence. Transcendence through science and art, which affirms the self in idealistic, defiant, and splendid isolation, and immanence, usually associated with consumerism, typical for a defeatist attitude. Unaware of Percy's work, in an article published in 2010 in Romanian, I refer to the same attitudes as arrogance and resignation. Back to Percy's analysis, nothing ultimately helps, neither arrogant transcendence nor resigned immanence. And so, the failed billionaire turned failed TV celebrity turned failed dictator of the free world, you know whom I am talking about, is but a symptom of the crisis of the self in the age of science, when, in response to the impressive extent of our knowledge about almost nothing, with the downside of the self's reduction to an organism wholly dependent on its environment, both artificial and natural, in our desperate attempt to assert ourselves by way of having something and more, we crack under the pressure of work, duty, and society. And we do so much more often and definitely more tragically than our forebears ever did. Percy's analysis is merciless at this juncture. The modern human, the Anthropocene human, as we'd say today, experiences disappointment after disappointment with science itself, including, I quote, the debilitating strictures of modern psychology, which has not the means of saying anything at all about the self, let alone spirit, end of quote. Disappointment with work, family, school, politics, church, and social life. But if I got Percy right, the ultimate terror that haunts us is not that we're lost in space or in the meaninglessness of the space-time continuum, if you will, deprived as we are of internal geodesics in the chaos of knowing. For as he says, the self nowadays is other-directed rather than inner-directed. It's not merely that, not at all. Percy returns to this matter in another subtitle of his book, where he attaches a new meaning to the earlier statements. I quote that other subtitle. By the way, there are like 2 pages of subtitles. Why it is that of all the billions and billions of strange objects in the cosmos, novas, quasars, pulsars, black holes, you are beyond doubt the strangest. Thus, our final terror is not the fact of being lost in space within a silent universe whose vastness dwarfs us to insignificance. It is the fact of having no grasp of ourselves whatsoever, thinking reads or otherwise. The self evades computation, the mathematical apparatus needed for knowing the outer world, the big thing we have acquired in this great age of science. No wonder Percy notes later, I quote, "We don't seem to know much more about the psyche than Plato did," end of quote, which, by the way, is an understatement, since Plato and his early Christian progeny knew of the self much more than modern people do. The early Christian interest in the soul and introspection as a way of knowing the inner abysses represent a preemptive strike at the growing body of knowledge about nature, about the outer rims of reality. So a crusade in the name of the self. In turn, the awareness of Anthropocene people that the self eludes our own grasp is integral to the complex issue under consideration, namely, where we are at in terms of making sense of ourselves in this age of science and within a universe whose boundaries have been pushed far beyond our line of personal and technological sight. A universe Pascal aptly described so long ago as, I quote, "an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere." My quotations are from his Pensées reflections, so we are going to translate that title. But what is so problematic about contemporary cosmology, with its mathematical models and its vistas of an overwhelmingly vast universe, currently theorized as but a bubble in the endlessly complex tapestry of the multiverse? The problem, if we continue to call it so, is the existential drive of subjects or selves, Pascal's thinking reads, that refuse to be taken out of the equation. After all, we already know from Mircea Eliade that both Homo religiosus and its secular descendants are thirsty of life and the fullness of it. And as Walter Percy has it, for us humans, reality is ternary or triadic. It has tri-dimensional depths, I'd say. The social interaction of selves that send and receive messages about the world is integral to this triadic reality. The socially and culturally, or indeed symbolically constructed world is wholly unlike the binary scientific discourse that ignores the selves, together with their aspirations and desires, when it comes to weighing nature. Truth be told, conditioned as they are by the, I quote, anomaly of objectivism, Percy notes, scientists, quote again, don't have to take account of themselves or other selves in their science. Their ones and zeros might mean something, quantitatively speaking, but don't convey existential meaning. These ones and zeros altogether bypass both us and our meaningful communication with others. And so, concludes Percy, I quote, the science of the scientist can understand everything in the cosmos, but the self of the scientist. The exclusion of the self in the company of selves when it comes to talking about nature, opposes everything we humans stand for. As such, it is inhuman. Science might be our creation, but it plays the game as though it doesn't need us. The situation is unbearable. Imagine Pinocchio deliberately refusing to become a real boy, the Tin Man despising the thought of having a heart, and Star Trek The Next Generation's character Data relinquishing the pursuit of humanization. I had to add this one as an homage to Mark Worthing's presentation last time about sci-fi. But this precisely is what we did when we discovered ourselves extricated from the algorithm of reality. We yielded. Unavoidably, Percy notes, I quote, difficulties arise when triadic creatures, scientists, try to explain evolution, and I would say any other scientific facts, through exclusively dyadic events that reduce reality to objects and to objectivist theorizations about them. Humankind is that thing within the universe which, in Percy's words, I quote, has an environment, but it also has a world. The latter, the world, is understood as resulting from the self's socio-cultural transactions of sign giving and sign receiving when talking about nature. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, Dumitru Stăniloae, Romanian theologian, made the same point in 1979, namely that the world, the totality of things within the universe, is not only out there, an objective reality, it also is the content of what people communicate among themselves. In the absence of the world as a socially verbalized reality, as communicated message or as signs given and received, the self has no place to lay its head, and everything turns existentially meaningless, causing the self's crisis. This is where science in general and scientific cosmology in particular become abhorrent, inhuman. The widespread resistance of cosmologists to the anthropic principle, with its common sense link between the human phenomenon and the universe, says it all. It comes easier to them to get lost in the hideaways of dark energy and in the multiverse's nirvana, the total bliss of the self's annihilation. As Percy describes the situation, quote, every advance in an objective understanding of the cosmos and in its technological control further distances the self from the cosmos precisely in the degree of the advance, so that in the end the self becomes a space-bound ghost which roams the very cosmos it understands perfectly. Very well said indeed. But there is an element of exaggeration in the last statement, an assumption that usually goes unchallenged. Most people taking it axiomatically. It is the conviction that we understand the universe perfectly. In an age when mystical concepts such as dark matter and dark energy have become widespread, with many cosmologists introducing themselves as experts in the dark side of reality, we can be a little more realistic and more honest than this. As a matter of fact, Geraint Lewis from the University of Sydney tells me that we don't know more than 20% of the universe, with this figure seemingly being an extremely optimistic assessment of the situation. It would be closer to the truth to say, therefore, that we know immensely about a mere fraction of an immeasurable, elusive bulk of reality, that we are training our minds and instruments upon whatever our science and technology make available to us, while in fact we remain disappointingly ignorant of what our mathematics doesn't dream of and what our tools aren't able to perceive. The way the natural sciences in principle exclude the supernatural from their scope, they are blind to the dark side of reality. The best they can do about it is to acknowledge its existence, stubbornly resisting our mighty attempts at pinpointing it. This being the case, I wholeheartedly agree with H.P. Lovecraft's following assessment. Though the area of the unknown has been steadily contracting for thousands of years, an infinite reservoir of mystery still engulfs most of the outer cosmos. But hitting Planck's wall, so to speak, will now the natural sciences humbly accept the existence of the self? I do hope so, for the sake of science and for our own, as selves and as thinking reads. Either way, the Anthropocene shrinking self should stop worrying. The universe is unimaginably vast and strange, indeed, but our science hasn't managed to exhaust its mystery, far from it. Our glorious techno-scientific culture has fallen short from the task of killing mysteries. Its mathematics can grasp neither the universe, nor the self, nor even more elusive dwellers of the jungle of numbers, nor many other things in the world, for, as Roger Penrose shows, reality is not computable, at least not in its fundamental traits. In Penrose's words, the world might, for example, be deterministic, but non-computable. Accordingly, the free will that we believe ourselves to be capable of would have to be intimately tied in with some non-computable ingredient in the laws that govern the world in which we actually live. That non-computable ingredient inbuilt within the laws of physics is, in turn, could elude us forever, says Penrose. But let's consider for another moment what Percy calls the predicament of the self in the age of science, as well as the predicament of its placement in the world. We have seen above that for Percy, doing science and cultivating the arts are attempts at transcending the impoverished nature that awaits the self at the end of counting the ones and the zeros of the scientific discourse. But are doing science or cultivating the arts a solution for all, or at least for many of us? Could all of us, or at least many of us, be scientists or artists? Obviously not. Then what could the grassroots self do to overcome the nonsensical, pointless existence to which the ones and zeros of science and the discovery of cosmic immensity have condemned it? When the mathematical models and the current theories fail to account of its presence, how could the self find itself in the world? It is at this juncture that things tend to turn for the better. We have already seen that our scientific tools leave us bereft even of the universe we thought we knew so well. The same goes for other areas of scientific inquiry, each new discovery unveiling more chasms of mystery before us. We have already hit Planck's wall, literally and figuratively, and transcending our insignificance through doing science and cultivating the arts does no longer suffice to soldier on. Does this mean, then, that we should abandon the quest and get drowned in immanent consumerism? Not necessarily. My own tradition, Orthodox Christianity, gives an indirect response to this conundrum. Paraphrasing, it goes as follows. If you are marginalized and exiled, then embrace marginalization and exile. And I quote, "Have the mentality of an exile in the place where you live." End of quote, says Ava Pimen, a desert elder, I think from the 5th century. His wisdom is very dear to me, actually. Accordingly, the self must embrace the fact of being deprived of itself and dispossessed of its meaningful world, and try to do something about it, to return, to earn its place in the world, and to enjoy the knowns and the unknowns, the known knowns and the known unknowns, the unknown knowns and the unknown unknowns, if I got Donald Rumsfeld right. My favorite Romanian poet, Lucian Blaga, chose to embrace the mystery of existence, to articulate the mystery, as he says somewhere, singing in 1919. I don't step upon the world's corolla of wonders, and I don't extinguish by my mind the mysteries I meet in my journey. That's my poor translation. It's very melodious in Romanian. If you want it, eu nu strivesc corola de minune a lumii și nu ucid cu mintea tainele ce le întâlnesc în calea mea. în flori, în ochi, pe buze, ori morminte. Și așa mai departe, and so on and so forth. And here is Percy's relevant advice. Quote, like Copernicus and Einstein, turn the universe upside down and begin with a new assumption. This precisely is what I'm proposing in the remaining part of this paper. Neil, could you show us, please, that photo? This is a Neolithic double sculpture found in Romania, a culture that existed, according to archaeologists, like 5.5 millennia BC. And these two small statues, they are very small actually, show a thinking person, very much looking like a man, a male, and a sitting woman. Obviously, the proportions show us that it's a woman. Both in that sitting posture, both apparently thinking. And every time I have doubts about myself, I look at this photo and I think of these people who were thinking so many millennia ago. And these two images are for me, I don't know, amazing. Something that captures humanity. A thinking person, you know, and a woman looking upwards, it seems, while being sitting. How will the self embrace its exile? How will it execute another Copernican turn, this time round from being other-directed to being inner-directed, to use Percy's phraseology? And how can the self do so without losing sight of the outer world and its wonders? Several stages are foreseeable. First, I would say that the exiled self will need to learn mathematics in order to speak the language of the country. More so, it will have to find enjoyment in it, in measuring things, in weighing stuff, and in theorizing about all things in heaven and on earth, knowns and unknowns alike. In the process, second, it could learn that there are people there, many scientists among them, who identify either the self or something like it as the foundation of things, calling it, as John Barrow does, an underlying rationality that transcends the material universe. And you'll find, if you are interested in this topic, a plethora of great cosmologists of our age saying something similar. Paul Davies comes to mind. He says that similar stuff in many places. There's this kind of rationality, this kind of thought, thinking to be found in the infrastructure of things. For patristically inclined scholars like me, this isn't a new thing. When he writes, I quote, everything that comes into being is generated by means of reason, end of quote, Gregory of Nyssa, 4th century author, echoes a venerable philosophical tradition whose roots are much older than its Christian iterations. But the fact that contemporary scientists tend to express related views is encouraging. Something's cooking in the kitchen, and I shiver in anticipation to see where the thinking of Roger Penrose, Henry Stapp, and many others like them will lead our culture next. Third, and taking its cue from these trailblazers, the self will have to boldly try to connect the dots, to bridge the inner and the outer worlds, perhaps by way of semiotics. At least this is what Marcello Lamattina from the University of Macerata contemplates as the task of our times. In a magnificent study recently published in the ISCAS journal, Lamattina militates for the transformation of the contemporary sciences, humanistic and hard ones alike, by connecting the objects and the subjects of knowledge whose nexus both camps currently ignore. Percy would have greatly rejoiced at hearing it, I'm certain. This would entail, I think, to interiorize science, to reclaim its humanity, and to bring it back into the service of the self and its flourishing. Contemplative theory and praxis appear to be quite useful in this regard. On this note, I turn to the contributions of two early Christian thinkers, Clement and Athanasius of Alexandria. I begin with the more recent one, Athanasius. Athanasius sketched two approaches to nature contemplation, one focusing upon the selves, or literally the mindful soul's Godwards journey, while the other tackles the cosmos. The first approach entails the steps of introspection, soul travel, and divine vision, in terms not unlike those of the Platonic tradition, but accompanied by salient Christian elements such as faith, grace, and ascesis. He shows that when the mindful soul is graciously enhanced, theologically guided, and ascetically purified, its grasp of reality, including its own reality, exceeds what the ancient ways of thinking made possible. I wonder if that is not also the case of modern ways of knowing, of which none, to my knowledge, has reached yet. For example, St. Columba's perception of the universe as a single ray of the sun, a unified vision of reality. By the way, I have recently finished a long study of this topic of introspection and divine vision in Athanasius, and submitted the article to a very important journal. 8 months down the track, I haven't heard from them. Well, from the reviewers, it's there, I know. They told me that it's there. But anyway, this is how the machinery works these days. The second Athanasian approach refers to inquisitiveness and research with the paradisal Adam of Genesis, resembling a Platonic mystic, as Eginhard Meyering has it, gazing upon the universe with pure eyes, full of wonder, but also equipped with such intellectual tools of the Paideia curriculum as astronomy, geometry, and metaphysics. There you have it, interpretation of Genesis 2. Adam the scientist. This interdisciplinary quest leads, for example, to the discovery of the natural weakness, fluidity, and mortality of the cosmos. This might shock some of us who draw a sharp line between the paradisal experience of the world and humanity and the so-called fall. Well, Athanasius wasn't a fan of this sharp line. From research and drawing on faith convictions, the contemplative person proceeds to identifying signs of divine providence in the cosmos. A string of analogies helps articulating the findings. For example, as the lyre's music points to the skills of the musician who plays the song, the ordered universe denotes its maker's wisdom and providence. Next, the contemplative person advances to higher gnosis, higher knowledge, and perceives the creation through a divine lens. So it's a matter of a telescoped view from above. Thus, grasping certain divine attributes leads to a perception of the universe as God's creation and as the object of divine compassionate love. This exercise is conducive, lastly, to the gnosis regarding the divine, which refers to contemplating God the Logos, creator and provident agent, and rejoicing in his company. It's always about knowing and finding fulfillment and enjoyment. It's never knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Athanasius does not explicitly connect the two approaches, but it would not come as a surprise to me if he considered the mindful soul's journey central to integral to the contemplation of the cosmos. If that is the case, then here, knowing the self and knowing the universe cross paths in the most creative and fulfilling of ways. It is noteworthy that both ways of contemplating natural items, such as the self and the cosmos, seem to require a method, though Athanasius does not say it plainly. More straightforward about the need of a method is Clement, 3rd century author, the first Christian author to have consistently affirmed the ethical requirement of personal transformation through purification and virtue as a prerequisite for knowing. But this requirement is not all there is to the method. Like Abraham and Moses, the contemplative person must be a master of the curricular disciplines, the available sciences, and so the method includes existential and intellectual components. Here, the self is not bypassed by mathematics in the effort of knowing. So equipped, in order to reach a comprehensive grasp of the cosmos, the contemplative person follows 3 steps. These are analysis or description, interpretation or reflection, and vision or the Gnostic grasp of things. The first step is una scienza della natura, as Laura Riserio has it, a genuine natural science, including theorizing, experimenting, analyzing, and synthesizing information. There you have it, the whole length and breadth of the scientific method, long before the modern sciences emerged. As a result, the contemplative person gathers accurate knowledge about the physical world, not allowing either science or the vastness of the cosmos to overwhelm him or her. Remember the 2 statues? And I confidently use inclusive language when talking about Clement, who believed that the Gnostic path is for all, irrespective of gender. What matters is that the contemplative person embraces the status of an exile that thirsts to be at home in the universe. The second step is about translating the scientifically acquired knowledge of the natural world in the reader's familiar categories. As his audience was primarily ecclesial, Christian, Clement deployed a range of traditional tropes, scriptural and liturgical, in order to depict the cosmos as, for example, a psalm, a song, an orchestra, a musical instrument, or a choir, a liturgical choir. Cosmologists who in our day and age refer to string theory do the same, as thinkers did before, from at least Pythagoras. Well, at least if we choose to ignore the mythical renditions of the most profound insights into reality produced by archaic societies, of which some are still with us, thank God. Clement's third step can be called the vision of the saints or the divine vantage point. While the first stages of the method are available to you and me, the third one is reserved for the aristocrats of the spirit, the saints. One needs to be so intensely transformed in God's presence that his or her view of things becomes divine and from above, as it were. Just remember Columbus' perception of the universe as a single ray of the sun. That's not human perception, is it? Clement himself points out that together with Christ and led by him, the contemplative person comprehends that, or what the created beings presently are, what the future things will be, and how the things that have been brought into being have come to be. This grasp of reality doesn't require either mathematics or telescopes or any other tools. It entirely is the outcome of personal transformation, the province of the self, where it rules supreme, but not as in Percy's mock transcendence via science and art. Transformed, the self rules truly in ways that far exceed all our dreams and computations and rationalizations. Either way, what Clemens proposes is a method of linking the knowing self, the sciences, ecclesial realities, and God, the best of all worlds. In short, both Clement and Athanasius train contemplative lenses at reality for the purposes of understanding it, both part and whole. This method corresponds to what nowadays we would call an interdisciplinary approach, straddling the natural sciences, the humanities, and theological insight, with the added bonus of not excluding either God or the self from the algorithm of knowing. Especially interesting is the shared point about transformed persons who attain wholeness and flourish, and who manage to find themselves at home in a universe that, albeit mysterious and overwhelming, is neither irrational nor impossible to read. I am deliberately using the verb to read here, thinking of Paul Blauer's compelling argument in favor of taking the traditional forms of nature contemplation as analogues of spiritual hermeneutic, a cosmic lectio divina, if you would wish. At the end of the 4th century, Evagrius Ponticus captured this idea beautifully by way of a dialogue between Anthony of Egypt and an unnamed inquirer. One of the sages, says Evagrius, of that time came to righteous Anthony asking, "Father, how do you endure to be deprived of the constellation of books, telescopes, microscopes, computers, and so on?" But he answered, "Lover of wisdom, my book is the nature of created beings, and it is in it that I wish to read about God's principles." Anthony's answer sums up a whole theological theory of nature contemplation, including reading, which entails education, and insight, which denotes personal transformation. So equipped, the contemplative person grasps the divine principles of things, the rational infrastructure of reality, in order to make sense of the world and to find enjoyment in it. No wonder Anthony's reaction when he encountered beauty in the desert. As Athanasius tells us, he journeyed for 3 days, found the mountain water crystal clear, sweet and very cold. Spreading out from there was flat land and a few scraggy date palms. Anthony, as though inspired by God, fell in love with that place. All good and fine, you'd say, but is this ancient Christian wisdom applicable in any way to our own circumstances? If that indeed is your question, then my answer is an emphatic yes. Especially Clement's method, except for the last step, is available to each and every one of us. I have tried it and often, and I return to it frequently, though not on a daily basis. And I fall in love with what I see. But you don't have to listen to me. There is an interesting new trend in scholarship that focuses on the contemplation of nature, wonder, and awe as ways of making sense of reality and of attaining personal well-being and joy. For example, in his Boyle Lecture 2021, Tom McLeish advocates the rediscovery of contemplation through science in a manner that would have made Clement happy. In a way, a similar path treads Bruce Foltz, who crossbreeds patristic contemplative approaches and intellectual tools of our age in grasping mysteries that cause us wonder and enjoyment. In turn, Lisa Sedaris comes to the rescue of the estranged self by telling us that wonder at the natural world does not require our becoming hard scientists, especially given that all of the knowledge we have gained detracts us from reality. While she says in an interview, "I can't necessarily understand the physics or theories behind the universe," cultivating wonder through the senses is something we can all do in some way. We can go beyond oneself, as children do, to, I quote, "a kind of pleasurable, delightful state in which to lose oneself in a completely enjoyable way." More than curiosity does, wonder is a matter of, again, quote, "thinking about God and God's creation, a kind of reverential feeling toward the Creator." Wonder is the more important as we realize that in English, Sedaris points out, this word might be related to wound. And as such, wonder makes you vulnerable, but then many good things can come from that kind of vulnerability. And we wounded selves are seeking, isn't it, to find ourselves in this world and to flourish in it. This, I believe, is one of the lessons Elder Zosima gives to Alyosha in the Brothers Karamazov when he opens the youth's mind to the beauty of God's creation. This also is the wisdom of C.S. Lewis's image of the great dance in Perelandra, where we learn that the center present nowhere and everywhere might not be the worst news ever for our estranged self. We might not know about the natural world as much as we thought we knew, and we know even less about ourselves, but there are ways, in the light of the above, of somehow discovering ourselves in the crevices of so much unknowing. Ways of bridging, as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin has it, le tout et la personne, the whole and the person, the greatest achievement of what he calls le phénomène chrétien, the Christian phenomenon. Are then contemplation and wonder the new Copernican turn, the way ahead for finding ourselves in the world, or ourselves in the world, and for flourishing in the world in the process? I hope they are. And that's where I leave it.
Thank you, Doru. Dare I say that was a tour de force. I really appreciated that. And that was lovely. Anyway, I'll hand it over to Lisa to respond. So over to you, Lisa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just realized this is a sustainable building, and I just realized that I'm not usually here at night. But if you don't move for half an hour or so, the lights go off. So if that happens again, I'll have to sort of get up and jump around a little bit. So thank you so much for asking me to respond to this paper. We have just recently become friends, have had a Zoom talk, but despite not having known you very long, I feel like there's a meeting of minds here. So thank you for inviting me. It's such a beautifully written paper, and there are so many provocative points. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things in my response, and not so much as critique of what you've said, but I think just kind of taking a couple of points in a different direction, maybe. So the 2 points I want to pick up on in particular, one is the idea of science in the service of the self, or a kind of interior science. And the other is the issue of exile, which I find very interesting. So I'm really intrigued by the suggestion, both yours and Walker Percy's, that our modern predicament is such that we know more about the cosmos than we do about ourselves. And I especially love the idea of exploring this theme in a mock self-help book, which I have not read and will have to track down. This predicament generates escapist impulses, as you discuss. One of these takes the form of a kind of transcendence through art or science, and one is a kind of consumerist or capitalist impulse, which is, I think, pretty obvious around us in the world. Neither approach ultimately offers a real remedy to what ails us, and I'm sort of using us here advisedly, because we can talk about sort of who it is that's suffering the most from these conditions. So neither approach offers a real remedy to what ails us, namely the manifest pointlessness of the cosmos. However, as you note, there's an important qualification here, or really a kind of counter argument, that in fact we do not know nearly so much about the cosmos as we like to think that we do. And I really appreciate that point as well. And that the cosmos might in fact be not just an as yet unsolved mystery, but an unsolvable mystery. And I suspect that it is. So taking this to be true, I think this lessens the contrast between all that we know of the universe and our inability to grasp ourselves. We couldn't kill the cosmic mystery if we tried, and we should stop worrying about it. But there's more to the predicament of the self in the age of science. If I'm following you correctly, the predicament persists in part because the universe simply has nothing to do with us, and vice versa. My own view, parenthetically, is that this is probably true, at least in terms of sheer scale. There's a way in which it's hard to see how our lives matter in or to the universe. Put differently, the problem is that the modern subject, and this is how you put it, the modern subject and the object of knowledge are disconnected. We need to somehow, quoting you, interiorize science to reclaim its humanity and to bring it back into the service of the self and the self's flourishing. So contemplation seems to be one way of accomplishing this goal. The invitation to interiorize science, or perhaps to re-interiorize it, puts me in mind of Peter Harrison's arguments in his book, The Territories of Science and Religion. On Harrison's account, our customary terms of science and religion, both in the past, once connoted something far more interior than they do today. Science once referred to an inward disposition or a habit of mind, a virtue even. science as something interior persisted until around the 16th or the 17th century, as Harrison argues, when it began to morph into an external or externalized body of knowledge, something that's out there in the world, beyond the knower. This externalization put it on a collision course over time with religion, which also became externalized as a thing rather than an interior kind of piety or practice. But more to the point here, interiorized science entailed a notion of improvement that was different from progress in science. Progress in science as a kind of depersonalized, externalized body of knowledge. Instead, there was a kind of interior progress, if progress is even the right term here, a kind of perfection, a moral and intellectual excellence, the pilgrim's progress. And so Harrison writes, quote, "The growth of science was understood as taking place within the mind of the individual before it began to be something that was external to the person." Although it's not really just the mind, I think it's also, depending on which thinkers he's looking at in this book, it's also, it's a moral, has a moral component, it has an affective component, so it's not simply the mind, but it is a kind of interiorized science. But then all of that came to an end, or at least the interiorized dimension of science began to be conceived of as something that was merely a means to the end of accumulating more of the external body, the knowledge out there in the world. So the interior element hasn't disappeared entirely, but it's been sort of eclipsed by this idea of science as something out there. The idea that science as a habit was bound up with certain virtues was premised on a moral order of the cosmos, Harrison continues, an idea that would come into conflict with the new, we might say, the modern idea of science as an objective and external thing. Again, quoting Harrison, "The vast expansion of the cosmos, the idea of empty space, the evacuation from nature of transcendental meanings, all presaged a mute universe that seemed to offer no moral guidance to those who studied it," end quote. And at this point, interestingly, Harrison invokes as paradigmatic of this modern universe, Steven Weinberg's famous quote about how the more comprehensible the universe is, right, the more pointless it appears to be. So yeah, exactly your point. Although Harrison's discussion of interior science doesn't map entirely onto your idea of interiorization, for example, I don't think he uses the word contemplation. There are moments when it seems to suggest something like that. Nevertheless, there are some common themes here that might be worth revisiting in your endorsement of a stronger connection between the subject and the object of the modern cosmos. And I'm sure you're familiar with his work. So my second point about exile, on this note of modern cosmos or modern science, I want to pick up on something having to do with, I guess, some of the references that you made to Adam and to the fall, and perhaps hearing hearing you speak about this, I think maybe reading it, I got a slightly different impression. So this is something we can talk about in just a moment, the importance of the fall, if it is important at all. So drawing on your own tradition, you encourage us to embrace our condition of exile, which is interesting because that's not something you typically hear people say, right? To embrace your sense of being exiled. The contemplative person embraces the status of an exile that desires to feel at home in the universe. So what remains unclear, or maybe somewhat unelaborated in my mind, is exactly when or where, in your mind, this exile began. So was it a function of modern science? That's the impression that I have from your paper. The paper hints, I think, that it's a product of modern science and the modern cosmos. And yet the sentiment of exile has been expressed forever, not least in creation myths of the so-called Western religions. Isn't exile the very theme of the story of Eden? So perhaps you're hinting at this point, when you invoke Adam in paradise, I guess this is the sort of pre-fall Adam. Adam is the Platonic mystic, gazing upon the world with wonder and a commanding intellect. The theme of exile seems rooted in this Edenic narrative, where nature turns against the transgressing human. Nature retains a moral order of sorts, but it metes out punishment and retribution. Mystical joy and knowledge and wonder seem to be gone. that is, after the fall. In contrast to this narrative, Indigenous scholar Robin Wall Kimmerer offers a creation story of her own people. There are many variations on this Indigenous story. It's the story of Sky Woman falling. The contrast with the exiled human of the Genesis account is striking. In this story, Sky Woman, who's a kind of Mother Earth-like deity, although she's kind of a human too, as sort of with, Greek gods and goddesses, has sort of qualities both of the gods and of humans. She falls to the earth from sky world, from a hole in sky world. The animals gather together to break her fall. The geese extend their soft wings like a feather bed. The turtle offers his back as a place of rest. One of the animals even sacrifices himself to help her, but he manages to bring back a small fistful of dirt from his fatal journey. And from this bit of earth, the animals and Sky Woman collaboratively make the world together. So I'll read a section here from Kimmerer, where she describes the myth. Quote, Sky Woman bent and spread the mud with her hands across the shell of the turtle. Moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, she sang in thanksgiving and then began to dance. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks, not by Sky Woman alone, but from the alchemy of all the animals' gifts, coupled with her deep gratitude. That's how the world was made. As she fell, and that's the end of the quote, but as she fell, she clutched in her hand a branch from the tree of life, interestingly, which she had, as she was falling from the sky, had sort of pulled with her. And from this, all the seeds of all the plants and all kinds of beautiful flowering things and edible food, all of these were scattered on the ground. And this made the world green and bountiful. There's more to the story because there's always more to stories like that. But Kimmerer's point is clear. No sense of exile casts a dark shadow in this creation story. There is no banishment. One story, Sky Woman's, leads to the generous embrace of the living world. The other, the Genesis story, tells us that we don't deserve nature's generosity. One woman, Sky Woman, is the ancestral gardener and the humble co-creator of everything. The other, Eve, is an exile just passing through an alien world. To survive in this world, Eve must subdue it. It's interesting here that she focuses on Eve rather than Adam, and on female figures in general, I think. Eve cannot allow herself to see the other plants and animals as animate, sentient co-creators. And so she must find her way back somehow through domination of nature. Of course, Kimmerer and I both are talking more about the earth here than the cosmos, because as you know, from having read some of my work, I think that this planet is really the most important thing. I think the natural world as we experience it is our home, and the cosmos maybe not so. It's kind of, that's the alien environment to us. But even though we're talking about the earth, Sky Woman's story is a cosmology, in other senses of the word. The erasure of any notion of exile makes all the difference in the morals of these two creation myths. But it's worth noting that Sky Woman herself immigrated from elsewhere. She was not native. She was the original immigrant. Maybe not an exile, but not a native either. The immigrant becomes native, Kimmerer argues through this story, through acts of reciprocity, through co-creation with other intelligences. She has to earn her place, to use your phrase. She has to earn it to become, to overcome her status as an immigrant or an exile. So I'm not suggesting that Christians should adopt the creation story of another culture, but it's not clear to me that the experience of exile and alienation is a product of modern science and its portrait of an indifferent cosmos. To be sure, modern science may have intensified this experience, and this is also, I think, the implication of Harrison's account of science becoming an externalized body of knowledge, distinct from the knower, advancing according to its own literally depersonalized logic. And ultimately, Harrison, by the way, doesn't really argue for bringing the two together, the sort of the interior and the exterior again. It's more just a way of showing how science and religion came to be in conflict because of the way we think of both of them as something out there in the world. But I think what you're doing is actually trying to put those two things back together again. So the problem then seems not so much in science or modern science, but ultimately seems to lie in the oldest stories we tell about our relationship to the cosmos, and the suggestion in one story that we belong to a place and it to us only through acts of domination rather than collaboration. For humans are not just triadic or dyadic, we are, as many people would say, multi-species creatures, co-constituted and co-constituting creatures. Better yet, as Kimmerer understands the Sky Woman myth to suggest, perhaps our job is not just to tell stories all the time, but to shut up and listen to them now and then. To listen to the stories, the wisdom of plants and animals, who after all, were the ones who were here first, the true natives. This kind of deep listening, I think, surely qualifies as a contemplative practice that reconnects the self to the outer wondrous world. And I'll just mention at the closing of my comments that the idea of listening to the natural world as a contemplative practice is something that I became really interested in the last few years. And I hadn't really thought about wonder as being a contemplative practice so much, but I had read in particular a piece by Douglas Christie about contemplative practices in nature, and a few other things that, you know, during the pandemic, a lot of people have been paying a lot of attention to the natural world, especially when they sort of had nothing else to do, right? A lot of people became more interested in birds, watching birds, listening to birds, and that's something that happened to me, although I was interested in them already. But I began to realize how much, listening to nature and just paying attention, just being attentive, is a form of prayer. And so I think all of these things, you mentioned people who are turning to wonder, people like me, other people who see this as kind of a new way of overcoming what's wrong with our relationship to the cosmos. And I think that those kinds of practices of listening to the natural world, trying to learn to understand the language of other creatures around us is part of that trend as well. So anyway, thank you for this beautiful paper, and I hope those comments will spur some additional thoughts and conversation between us and between all of you who are listening. So thank you again. It's really quite lovely.
Thank you very much for that, Lisa. That was a lovely response too, and I'm sure it will generate some interesting discussion. I suggest we take a 5-minute break, get a cup of coffee or tea, or how about we give ourselves 5 minutes and we come back at 10 past the hour. I will open it up for discussion. Yeah, I'll open it up. Perhaps, Doru, you might just like to start with a bit of a response to Lisa's paper.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you very much, Lisa. It's been really illuminating. I think you have chosen the two main concerns as the topics of your response, science in the service of the self and the topic of exile, and you did beautifully. There's so much to learn, and I did learn from your response. What's interesting is your reference to Peter Harrison, that point you made, analyzing his ideas, that there's this correspondence between externalized religion and externalized science. I haven't thought of it when I wrote this paper, and why am I pointing fingers at scientists and their science when what religions do, including Christianity of all sorts, is the same. We actually live at the outskirts of the religious phenomenon. Spirituality is a footnote or a chapter in the history of a religion or the experience of a religion, and it means that in reality we managed to do the same much earlier, actually, than scientists were able to do by I don't know, transforming the whole religious phenomenon into some kind of senseless string of traditions and rituals and prescriptions that serve no self. So that I'm very grateful for this point, really, and I'll try to bring it in somehow, so that my critique of the sciences isn't one-sided. We are worse because we're supposed to know better. And when I say we, it's because I'm Christian and most of us here are, and we actually should do better, at least on this front. So thank you very much for this. There's also very interesting your sort of question mark about the usefulness of the fall. Personally, I would say that it's not useful at all. It's a construct, a cultural construct that is not even encountered in the scriptures. Yeah. So we have invented it because it's easier to go by the tradition rather than trying to be truthful to wisdom. And when I say tradition, I'm talking about Hesiod's, the famous Greek poet in antiquity, Hesiod's idea of ages, the golden age followed by the silver age, and so on and so forth. And that's it. That's the fall. That's the Christian fall, which isn't Christian at all. And so, yeah, when we look at early Christian and other scriptural testimonies through the lens of the fall, this extraneous category, of course, we misunderstand everything. But it's interesting. Yeah, you're right. It's interesting that in Genesis, yes, we have the idea of an exile where humanity is pushed out of that paradisal experience and has to look at the world and inhabit the earth to the best of its ability. And we know what happened. Things degraded to the extent that there was need of a flood to wash all the trouble away. Of course, it didn't stop there. That's another story. But yeah, that's a category that we should question. The category of fall. What does it mean in terms of our worldview, in terms of our understanding of things? Of course, I'm offering here only a hypothesis that we don't need it. People might stick to their own convictions. Also interesting in your response was the reference to the Sky Woman story, so indigenous wisdom, and I resonate a lot with it. I don't know how Australian I have become in 16 or 17 years of my sojourning on these shores, but I know that one of my main targets from day one of my coming here was to appropriate some of the wisdom of the actual inhabitants, the natives of the land, who know the ins and outs of climates, the ins and outs of seasons, and where and so on and so forth. And I found it very insightful on many levels. Talking about the fall and your Sky Woman, there's a Central Australian story. I don't remember the name of the tribe. There's a story, paradisal story, with a village where the main deity Bayame, if I pronounce correctly, plants something like an orchard, very interesting trees, and the gods would come from time to time to take the fruits of those trees and make nectar, and that would sustain them in whatever their transcendent kind of life. there's a season, too much drought and stuff like that, and the villagers are very thirsty and hungry, and the only source of food is that orchard. But there's an interdiction. Sounds familiar? You can't touch those trees. You can't eat from those trees. But out of hunger, the women of the village, Eve, tried to sneak out of the village and take some of those fruits. Surprise, surprise, a band of gentlemen awaits for them there and says, no way, you go away. And because of this resistance to temptation, the entire village was rewarded with abundant crops and water and all that. Various Genesis stories, if you like. Okay, well, now the last thing that I would like to say is the point, and you're very, very right about it, that the idea of exile is not something new. But I used it. Yes, I give you that. I have to strengthen this point. I used it in order to show that we have become strangers in our backyard. And this is precisely what happened in the last 3-4 centuries, or started to happen to us because of certain choices, cultural choices, that led us to this point in time where we are no longer in control, which is very interesting, because people keep talking about being in control, and we aren't in control of anything. We live in a world of experts, and we have lost altogether any chance, any opportunity of becoming more than we are. A headache, well, I go to the pharmacist who knows better what Panadol to give. I want to make sense of, I don't know, the weather. Will it rain? Well, instead of looking up to see if there are any clouds, no, I take my mobile, my cell, and I go to the app, and so on and so forth. I don't know anything. I just push some buttons. And this is actually the last bit, hopefully, of this alienation, this exile of ours. Anyway, there's a lot to say here, and I think I shall still stick to the topic of self-exile that has been imposed on us by our cultural choices. However, the fact that we can withstand the pressures of this culture that we have created by surrendering in an active, not passive way. In other words, okay, I no longer know weather patterns, fine. But I'll look at the how do you call it? I'll look at the app, and then I'll look up, and I'll try to make up my own mind and see if what the app says matches reality, a reality that I perceive. And from this point, I can reconstruct my whole world, where world is not only the natural world, it's also the world of science and representations. Thank you very much once again, Lisa.
I'm quite excited that these things are being discussed. My question is, are you aware of Esther Meek's work? She was just out here in Sydney. I'm not sure whether you're aware of that. And I helped bring her out through Gospel Conversations. Now, her work is Polanyian, and she talks about covenant epistemology, her books Loving to Know, and the idea of knowledge as personal. Do you want to comment?
I missed the name of who was the person that you brought out?
Professor Esther Meek. She lives in Pittsburgh. She's quite well known in certain circles, obviously not science circles, but she's a Polanyian, so she's pushing Michael Polanyi and that connection. There is a very strong connection here, just having listened to her and then listening to this conversation. The parallels are quite obvious.
Yeah, I might just interject in the sense of, I think there are a lot of people who are moving in this direction. I think there's a recognition that the current way in which we are doing things does not work, and we need to find alternative ways. And there is an alienation that we're experiencing that desperately needs to be overcome. So it's not surprising that we find so many parallel tracks of thinkers who are saying, yeah, there's something wrong here. There's something, perhaps a product of a fall, Doru, but anyway, that there is the same sort of things are emerging in terms of what I might call soul making, a reawakening, a reconnecting with the inner and its relationship to the outer.
Yeah, and Neil, if I can interject,
absolutely.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's a matter of finding a way back home inside, and it is from that point inside that we should sort of reappropriate everything, because it's not a matter of abandoning science. You know, I'm a science buff. Yeah, I read popular science as much as I read science fiction, but the idea is of trying to personalize it, yeah, to filter everything through our own personal reflection, thinking processes, experiences, much like Augustine, if I may. Yeah, remember in Confessions, what's that? Book 11, in the book 11 of Confessions, where he speaks of various kinds of time, and there's one particular passage where he speaks of a kind of internalized, personalized time. In you, my soul, I measure the times. I know even the Latin. Yeah, so it's a matter of doing what Augustine taught us long ago to do. You know, to become the masters of our creations.
Thank you, Neil, and thanks very much, Doru and Lisa, for your paper and your response, which were so interesting. Doru, you referred to Pascal and his fear of those infinite spaces, but as you know, around 1800, they developed a movement, let's say, nature romanticism, with great exponents such as William Wordsworth, I think in particular of his great poem, Lines Written Above Tintern Abbey, Goethe in Germany. So very important cultural figures who found spiritual nourishment and a sense of being at home in nature. Do you think that's achievable today, or is that something that we've just moved on from irretrievably? Can we be at home and nourished in nature in the way that Wordsworth and Goethe were? Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I'm certain that Lisa will have much more to say. As a matter of fact, Lisa and one of our attendees, Nicola Hogarth in New Zealand, they both work in this area of sort of finding ways, even for Christians, that's Nicholas turf, finding ways of inhabiting this earth, ways that include an appreciation for nature to an extent that at least Western Christians aren't accustomed to. Why I say Western Christians, it's because, well, long ago in the 80s, Mircea Eliade, the famous historian of religions, in an interview observed that there's a big difference between what he called the historicist kind of Christianity of the West and the cosmic Christianity of the Balkans. That's almost a quotation. The cosmic Christianity of the Balkans, where there's a different kind of placement of the self, the believing self, if you like, in the world, in the natural world. I personally have developed this sense of how important the contemplation of nature is, both because of my upbringing in that part of the world, but also because of my interest in early Christianity, where I found a very different sense of the Christian experience that includes the world, doesn't leave it out. So I think it's a task, it's a duty, and the fact that Lisa, Nicola, and many others, like my friend Bruce Foltz in Florida, try to do and do it successfully. Yeah, it's possible, and it's a task for us to retrieve this sense of the world. Plus, there's this added component for people like us living in places where there's a strong indigenous presence, Aboriginal presence, that we can learn from them. And again, Nicola talks about this thing quite a lot. And in conversation with our hosts on these shores, we can learn new ways or renew our interest in living, inhabiting these lands wisely and also with enjoyment.
Thank you.
Lisa, do you want to add something to that?
I certainly think it's possible to still live in these ways where we can feel connected and be at home. You know, one of the people who has influenced me the most in thinking about wonder and, you know, what it requires to have a sense of wonder and maintain it through life is Rachel Carson, whose idea of wonder is something that in many ways is it's not so much an extraordinary experience. You can have an experience of wonder in the most kind of mundane places, you know, in your own backyard, or, you know, just going out into your yard with a flashlight at night, or, you know, there are things around us every day that we just don't stop and look at them. So again, this idea of just paying deep attention to things is something that's a kind of, that can be cultivated, you know, that wonder is it's a way of being in the world. But I do think that, you know, I worry about the fact that younger generations don't even know what is gone from the world. You know, each successive generation is not aware of the way that the world has changed. So, you know, people refer to this as a kind of like, you know, environmental amnesia, a kind of generational amnesia. Because I think that, you know, if we want to really actively protect the natural world, you have to be attached to it. And if those things to which one could attach oneself are gone or disappearing, and we don't even know that, you know, then that's a very difficult thing. And, you know, it's not that there's no nature left out there anymore. There is plenty that we can still refer to as nature. That's a very contested term, but, you know, when I hear people talk about the Anthropocene and things like this, it's the idea that somehow the human imprint is everywhere, all over the world. There's nothing left that's natural. And that's just, you know, that's just a continuation, I think, of a very egotistical idea that we have, just as, you know, you were saying that, you know, like we look at our phones instead of looking at the sky, we think we're in control, but we actually are not in control at all, you know, and we're not in control of those things that are out there. I didn't make the birds, you know, are there of their own accord. So there are a lot of challenges, I think, to connecting, especially younger people who may not have grown up in a world where they spend a lot of time outside. But on the other hand, it's really a very simple thing to introduce anybody to the natural world, because there's so much that's wondrous that we just see every day and we just never pay any attention to. And as someone who just moved from a place where I had lived to, you know, for a very, very long time in the Midwest, in Indiana, in the United States, to California, which is a vastly different kind of place. I've thought a lot about what it means to make your home again, to be at home somewhere. And the way that I do that is just by really paying attention to things around me. And, you know, there are other things you can do too to support your local environment. But I mean, just to feel at home is to pay attention to things around you and to begin to recognize things that other people miss. People say there are no seasons in California. There are seasons in California. You just have to pay attention. If you're not paying attention, you might miss it. But yeah.
So it seems odd, the response that's being evoked by the James Webb telescope, these absolutely wonderful images of the cosmos that are touching something in people. And what's so interesting for me is that it's mediated by this absolutely superb technology that we've created, but it's opening up these wonderful images and people are captured by them. And anyway, let me return to Emily. Emily, do you want to put that into words? You still with us, Emily?
I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on the secular movement towards spirituality, things like yoga, using stone to like generate energies or whatever. I've noticed there seems to be a secular movement in that direction as opposed to religion. People have rejected religion, but seem to be embracing these elements of spirituality instead.
Thank you.
Well, I think the word secular means so many different things to different people. That's part of what's confusing about it, is that, I mean, we're told that, you know, societies, lots of societies, Australian, American, you know, have become secular, but, you know, as some people I've read recently argue, that they haven't become disenchanted. So, you know, maybe secularization has happened in some way, but there's definitely still a sense of enchantment, and some of those things are the ways in which that gets expressed. The spirituality and religion divide is one that's, you know, been around for a while. There's been people saying that they're not religious, but they're spiritual. I think that is partly a function of people misunderstanding religion as being something that's about, you know, propositions or creeds or beliefs only, and not kind of practices and well, maybe something more inward, you know, than like, you know, subscribing to some sort of set of laws or commandments or something like that. But yeah, so all of these terms, depending on how you define them, I think you can track a whole variety of trends that seem to contradict one another.
I was reluctant to address this one, but I think that Emily, there's some confusion there. Well, there's yoga in the West and there's yoga in India. Would you call a yoga in India a secular practice? And can yoga be considered the same with throwing stones at something? Plus, you mentioned religion. I would ask you back, but that's just rhetorical. What's religion? Christianity wasn't born a religion. Actually, it was born, and for at least 3 centuries existed as an anti-religious movement. What are we talking about? Take that rhetorically.
One of the interesting things for me is that these sort of practices in a different world would have been identified as pagan. We have this knee-jerk reaction almost to the fear of paganism when we turn to natural world. The concern that, you know, we're nature worshipping or pantheistic, or Pope Benedict raised the specter of neo-paganism in relationship to environmental movement. But yeah, there's that sort of dimension that it's regressive, whereas in often cases it's reflecting the sort of indigenous spiritualities that we need to reconnect with in some way. Martin, you have your hand up.
I just kind of want to make a bit of a comment. I think there's a sort of a middle ground between nature connection and a self-imposed disconnection or alienation, which is, what is the effect of, you know, in the last 500 years or even the last 200 years of technology upon our capacities to connect? So, you know, it might be a self-imposed deferral to science and technology over and above our experience in nature, but the capacity, especially of the electromagnetic thing. So, for example, someone mentioned Goethe, a teacher 100 years after Goethe, Rudolf Steiner in Germany, suggested that he could only speak his poetry because there wasn't, telegraphic wires above his head, and that was 100 years ago. So when we think of the telegraphic wires and the EMRs of modems and phones, how does that actually degenerate our capacity to have psychic experience and spiritual experience? I think that would be a whole realm of exploration, and therefore I don't think we are disempowered. I think we have a massive challenge to do the spiritual work, and therefore I think Emily's question, or was it Emily's question? Yeah, Emily's question of all these other movements are yearning and are seeking on how to rebuild the psychic somatic capacities to connect to other, especially nature. So just that whole sort of complex as a sort of a position between the two.
I know, for example, Lisa is interested in a slightly different topic of the strangeness of the large vistas open for us by the sciences, which have become some kind of an alien landscape. And you mentioned this, Lisa, earlier. We have no connection with those landscapes apart from the nice photos on the screen, they mean nothing in terms of our immediate experience. Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is something that also bleeds together with what Martin just said, but I think you, Lisa, would have to say a few things about his question or his point.
Well, I mean, I'm kind of a technophobe myself. Like, I think technology has changed us in all kinds of problematic ways. And our students, young people, even more than us. And again, one of the main ways in which, there are these studies that show people's, their attention spans going down steadily over the years. I think for young people today, it's something like, 8 seconds, or it was 12 seconds a few years ago, how long you can actually pay attention to something. And this is because of our phones in large part. And there's a way in which technology has kind of created new worlds for us that we don't really see ourselves. We see them through technology, and yet they're presented to us in this way as if they're going to reconnect us with the natural world. I mean, again, this goes back to looking at things like the view of the Earth from space, or what the images that are being captured by some of these telescopes, and just from orbiting, in space and sending these images back, that we're supposed to feel this strong sense of connection. But there's also something that's very, very alienating about that, and even objectifying, that we are now kind of disembodied ourselves, floating in space, looking at this planet that's sort of just like a planet like any other planet. There are planets everywhere. There's planets all over the universe. There's nothing, the sense of our own planet as being sort of special is being, mitigated by this. But, on the other hand, I've mentioned birds a couple times. I like to use my phone sometimes to, when I hear a bird and I'm not sure I can identify it, there's some really accurate apps that will tell you what bird you're listening to. This is one of the ways, since I moved to California, that I've learned a lot of the bird species. And I value that tool. I think that tools can be used in ways that can actually help people to connect to the natural world. But I think a lot of the rhetoric about how technology can do this, we should regard with some suspicion, because often the people who are behind that sort of rhetoric have a kind of otherworldly agenda in mind, and in a problematic way. Those are the same people telling us that, we need to learn how to live in space as soon as possible. And they're speaking this sort of pious language of environmentalism or spirituality. And I think it's a ruse, really. I think that they want us to support their endeavor, materially, and, try to convince us that we're all better off if we go into space. We know that only the richest of the rich will ever be doing that. So
thank you, Nancy.
Okay, when I'm thinking about this a lot and connecting it to my own research, just as a student, one of the things that's speaking to me, it really connects to this, is looking at the idea of the pre-Socratic. I'm looking a lot at the classics, okay, as well as the now in transdisciplinarity, but this idea of the pre-Socratic idea of truth as aletheia, as opposed to what it became in Plato, and which was sort of corresponding more and more to something. Okay, so the idea of disclosure, unconcealment. And it's I think it's very important here because it speaks into this idea of like what David Boehm, what you pick up with David Boehm with the implicate order, this enfoldment. And I'm not Orthodox, I study Orthodoxy, but the Orthodox tradition or the East really seems to be more maybe connected to this through well, one of the patristics, Maximus Confessor, the idea of the logos, okay, being the uncreated, and the logoi, all that is within everything that's created, coming from the logos. That means there's a unity. So this idea, when you put it together with, like Heidegger is saying, okay, let's look at how being has been discussed for all these years, 2,500 years. And when you look at it this way, it's the physicists are speaking, and the scientists that are looking at what is reality are actually speaking more like the pre-Socratics and in the way that well, the Orthodox have spoken along about being one with is what is knowing. So how that relates, I think, is with, and it's beautiful, I think, in the idea of transdisciplinarity, because they're calling for the, the transdisciplinary attitude. Somehow this, what comes out at here is the idea of being one with nature, which is very, very old in what it means to know. Okay, and so I think that's just something, to add to the idea of well, what is truth? If truth is aletheia, then, which is your basic, and this is where wonder really comes in, because wonder, theomazine, is actually the moment where something opens up to you. I'm wondering, is it actually, and the Christian tradition would say, all truth is contained within. That gets back to Plato's idea of, the knowledge is in there. It's all in there. It's nothing new. It's just this slowly bubbling up and being, disclosed to you. So just thinking about that, this idea, I just wanted to share. Maybe you have had some ideas about this, Doru, in the Eastern side of things. And with the wonder, I mean, it really comes together in aletheia. What is actually truth? As opposed to, just to say, the Western way of looking at it, the tradition, would be more and more corresponding to something like a fact. You're more and more true. It's a mathematical kind of iteration. I'm getting closer and closer to something as opposed to being one with it. So I didn't know if you have any thoughts about that, or if it rings true to you.
Thanks a lot, Nancy. Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, more and more people in the West become interested in this connectivity of things and of locating the center of reality in whatever existential truth you could call it. And this isn't something that pertains uniquely to Eastern Orthodoxy. I mention Eastern Orthodoxy because it's my context, and I usually try to stay away from passing judgment on other traditions, Christian or otherwise. So this is why I have given those examples from a tradition that means something to me. But yeah, you're right. There's a lot out there, and it seems that these archaic perceptions of reality, you mentioned the pre-Socratics, are very much in vogue. At least they used to be in the 20th century among quantum physicists. For example, one of the pioneers of quantum physics, Werner Heisenberg, in order to popularize the idea, to make it, accessible to the public, referred quite a number of times to the model of reality presented by Heraclitus, one of the pre-Socratics, although not the most archaic of them. And he referred to Heraclitus's model of reality, where there's logos at the center of all things, which is what? Rationality, principle, you name it. Yeah. There's fire, energy. there's movement, and then there's the material layer of reality of our immediate experience. So that was a non-intuitive model, because our only experience is with the outer shell of things. But contemplatively, Heraclitus could take out the onion layers, going towards the core of things, and he found the logos. Well, Heisenberg thought that was a classical intuition of reality that pretty much explains what quantum physicists do in our day and age. I don't know to what extent physicists today are sensitive to this kind of analogy. My suspicion, but don't say this aloud and don't tell this to anyone, is that they don't read the classics, and therefore they can't get the analogies right. But otherwise, they find analogies elsewhere in other places. No wonder some of them more familiar with Southeast Asian philosophies draw on those philosophies in order to communicate the non-intuitive message of contemporary physics. And the same happens in cosmology and stuff like that. How can this be used for the purposes of renewed, perhaps, Christian worldview? That's another story, and it requires an engagement, which I presume is what we try to do via these seminars, requires a bit of a foray on the part of Christians, theological trained or otherwise, into the land of science. As I said, perhaps we can become mathematicians. Neil is one of them. Or I don't know what else, or at least like me, we can read popular science and then get a sense of it, and how we can tap into this source of renewal for us. I'm not afraid to call it so.
As I was interested how often, Doru, you use words like rationality. I mean, you use them again then in your response. And I suppose it's such a trouble, it's a contested word, let's say. It's a contested word in the modern context, where rationality has become mechanized and instrumentalized. And how I think at one stage you talked about moving on to love, and there's a self-transcendence of the human person, grounded, yes, in the materiality in the natural world, and there is a self-transcendence, but the finality of that is not love, not just knowledge, but love. And that is, there is if you like, a sort of falling in love with the cosmos, a falling in love with God and all that God has made, that isn't just about knowing, isn't just about the rationality, but about an ecstatic embrace of something, and that captures us as whole people. There's a lovely line in, I think it's the Four Quartets, T.S. Eliot, the fire and the rose are one. The fire of intellect and the rose of contemplative love merge. And that's another thing that we've separated out. And we need to heal. That's my just my comment for you, Doru, to think about.
Well, thank you, Neil. And I should become more aware of the fact that we all are different people and come from very different backgrounds. In my own way of thinking, which is anchored in the Greek patristic tradition, rationality is a far richer thing than rationality in or post-enlightenment.
Yeah.
For example, while everyone in English calls the second person of the Trinity according to the Gospel of John, word, I call the second person of the Trinity in the Gospel of John logos, and logos isn't word, isn't only word, and it's not primordially word. It means principle, it means thinking, it means norm, it means rule, it means measure, it means many other things. So it's a far richer thing, and it has this interiorized dimension. And yeah, that's at the back of my mind when I talk about rationality. The rationality of the universe is not what we compute, and I think I made this point clear by referring to the wisdom of Roger Penrose. It's not about exhausting the mysteries by way of strings of equations, ones and zeros. The rationality, what I'm talking about, has more to do with what you would call perhaps a sense of order, but an intrinsic order, those patterns that we recognize now in nature, the fractal patterns and so on and so forth. That would be my comment.
Lovely, thank you. Look, I would invite you all to thank our speaker and our respondent. This has been an extraordinarily rich conversation. And I think we've all learnt a lot from it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.